Hi. So today we're going to talk about sampling. Okay? But before we do that, our word for the day is nomothetic. Okay? Nomothetic means that we're interested in the general case. It comes from the Greek word for law or nomos. So you could think about nomothetic in that we're interested in finding out laws or rules that apply to the general case. Okay? Instead of the individuals. If we were more interested in individuals rather than the general, then that is idiographic. But most social research is concerned with the nomothetic, the general case that applies to all people rather than the individual cases. We learn from the individuals so that we can better understand what is happening in the general case. Okay? So sampling is about selecting subjects to study. Okay, but in the principle of in the context of our word for the day, which is nomothetic, we're selecting subjects to study. We're selecting individuals to study so that we can learn about the population or the group that these individuals belong to. Okay. So how do you just collect your samples? The first is to define your population. So for example, in this case, we're trying to define average American college students. Okay? And we want to consider representative samples from the group. Okay? Our population of American college students is made up of males and females, where the black X's are the males and the red X's are the females. Okay? So in our sample, we have both males and females because we want the idea of representativeness, or the idea that samples represent the population, is that we expect or we hope that the findings we get from this sample, okay, can be used to help us better understand this population. Okay? So representativeness implies that the members of our sample, our subjects in our sample, will give us findings that reflect to a certain extent what is happening in the population. Okay, we want to find out about individuals because our main interest is finding out about the general population. Okay, or nomothetic. Okay, it's important to understand what population you will be drawing from. So it's important to be able to define clearly who or what your units of analysis are, because those are what you're going to make conclusions about. Your research problem should be stated in terms of the population and not your sample. Okay. There are two ways that we can do sampling. One is probability sampling, and the other is non-probability sampling. The difference is that in probability sampling, we have a list, we have a sampling frame, and we are able to determine what is the probability, okay, of a member of that population, a person in the population, to be selected to be a part of the sample. Okay, so probability sampling is a procedure that wherein each person in the population has a known chance of selection. In non-probability sampling, we do not have a sampling frame or that list of all members of the population. So it's impossible for us to say what is the chance of selection of any member of that population. In such cases, we use non-probability sampling. Okay? Whether you're doing probability sampling or non-probability sampling, okay, there will be some form of sampling bias that will occur. And sampling bias occurs when the sample is collected in a way that some members of the intended population are less likely to be included than others. For example, if you do an online survey, one specific form of sampling bias will occur because some people do not have access to the internet. Therefore, they will not have any chance of being selected for your population. So here is one of the first examples of probability sampling. This is simple random sampling. Okay, in simple random sampling, this is the case wherein each person in the population has an equal chance of being selected. You will, if you remember our definition of probability sampling, in probability sampling, each person has a known chance of being selected. Okay? Known chance does not necessarily mean equal chance. If you're talking of each person in the population having an equal chance of being selected, then you're talking about simple random sampling. Okay? Like in this case, we have 50 individuals in the population. Each member of the population has a 1 in 50 chance of being selected. So each person in the population has an equal chance of being selected. Therefore, we can do simple random sampling. Okay? So in this case, we randomly drew the names out of the hat or the numbers out of the hat, and we came up with this sample. Okay? You can do simple random sampling if the sampling frame is relatively small or manageable. But then it becomes impossible or unwieldy, very unwieldy, if the population becomes very, very big. Now, in cases where the sampling frame is known to be already in a random sequence, then you can use systematic random sampling. Okay? It starts with a random starting point. In this case, the researcher, for example, puts 50 names in a hat and draws out one and says, okay, we will start with number 3 in our list. Okay. And then from that starting point, there will be a fixed interval. Okay, from number 3, we select the fifth name on the list, which is number 8. Okay. And then we select the fifth after that, that's 13, 18, 23, 28, etc. Okay. Sometimes we have a sample wherein we have a research problem, wherein we're also interested in subgroups in the subgroups within our sample or population. We're interested in finding out differences in their answers, or we want to compare their answers. Okay? So in those cases, we want to make sure that we have a sample that also reflects the subgroups that we are interested in. Okay? So in case there are subgroups in the sample, then we can use stratified sampling, where we call the subgroups strata. Okay? So we have, like in this example, we have a population of 16 males, 16 black X's, and 15 males and 6 females. Okay, for a total population of 21. Okay, so in proportionate stratified sampling, we want to select a sample that reflects this mix of males and females. There are 15 males to 6 females in our population. That is 5 males to every 2 females, and so we draw a sample of 5 males and 2 females to reflect, which has the same proportion of males and females in the population. In this proportionate stratified sampling, we're not interested in matching the proportion of our groups. Like we're interested in 2 groups, 2 strata, males and females. In this population, there are significantly more females than males. There are significantly more red X's than black X's. Okay? If we were to draw a sample, a proportionate sample, we would have a very small number of black X's or males. Okay? But in this case, we want to know more. We want to know as much as possible about both groups. So in this case, we oversample the males. Okay, we oversample the males so that we get enough of them to be able to, so that we're confident about that the findings from the male members of our sample will be representative of the male members of the population that we used. Okay, oversampling means we select a number for our sample that is not equal to the proportion of. We selected more males for our sample, wherein the proportion of males in our sample is not equivalent to the proportion here. Right? In our sample, we have an equal number of males and females, whereas here in the population, clearly females are disproportionately larger. Okay? Now, in case there is no complete sampling frame, where, for example, especially when the population is very large or certain areas are not information is not simply not available, the researcher breaks the possible population into a set of smaller groups called clusters, okay, for which there are sampling frames, and then randomly choose clusters that you will include in your sample. Okay, so here, for example, this larger population, we can identify 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 clusters. Okay? And then from the 6, we randomly select 2 clusters to include in our study. And then within these clusters, we will randomly select our final sample. Okay? So cluster sampling and stratified sampling both involve grouping members of the population or members of the sample into groups. Okay, but the difference here is this: in a strata, okay, if you remember our example earlier, in a strata, here we have two groups here, one group of males and one group of females. Okay, in each group we can say that the members are relatively homogeneous. Okay, this group meaning they're the same. Okay, in this group, first group, all of them are males. In this group, all of them are females. In cluster sampling, when we draw our clusters, okay, our clusters will be mixed, will be heterogeneous. We will draw a sample of males and females from this cluster. We will draw a sample of males and females from this cluster also. Okay, so clusters are composed of heterogeneous members or mixed or a diverse group of members. Strata are composed of homogeneous or similar members. Okay. You can do cluster sampling because this involves larger populations, and then from the clusters you can either draw the sample directly, or if the clusters are too big and or you have interest in subgroups, then you can use stratified sampling within the cluster. Okay. So here's an example. We're interested. Remember when we started, we were interested in American college students. There are 50 states in the United States of America. Okay, so that's a large, very very large population of college students. So what we first do is we cluster the states into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 regions. Okay? 7 regions across the United States. And then from each region, so there are different numbers of states in each region, we randomly select a state within each region. Okay? So for example, for the Midwest, we randomly select Michigan. Okay? Within Michigan, so Michigan is now a cluster. Within Michigan, we can also find clusters of universities, clusters that we call universities. So there are probably more universities in Michigan, but we're interested in we're just for purposes of our example, there are 5. Okay, so from the 5 universities in Michigan, we randomly select one, which is the University of Michigan. Okay, now from the University of Michigan, we can draw a sampling frame. We can request a random list of students college students in the University of Michigan, and then from that list of students, then we select our final sample to be part of our study. Okay, so we can do clustering on different levels. So remember, first we clustered on the level of regions, then we clustered in a level of states, and then another level of clustering at the university level, and then we randomly selected university, and from there we drew our sample using any of the previous methods we talked about. We can do systematic random sampling or stratified sampling. Okay. Now, what about non-probability sampling? Remember, we said we do non-probability sampling if we have a case where we don't have a sampling frame. We cannot estimate what is the probability of selection of any member of our population. Okay. One method we can use is snowball sampling. Like, we don't know who are the members of our population. For example, we don't. Let's say we were interested in finding out. We were do a study on surfers in the Philippines, and there is no survey. There is no record. There is no official association that has that lists their members as surfers. Okay, so in snowball sampling, the researcher looks for a surfer. Okay, and then contacts that surfer, gets permission, gets their consent to participate in the study, and then does the interview or administers the questionnaire. And then from that first respondent or participant, the researcher asks, "Can you refer me to other people that you know of, other surfers that you know of?" So then the first respondent might recommend 3. Okay? And so the researcher does the same thing, administers the questionnaire again to those 3, and then asks them also to recommend others. So in that way, the ball or the snowball gets rolling, and then hopefully that it becomes bigger and your sample becomes bigger through snowball sampling. Okay, so it's simply a networking approach to finding the people that you're interested in. Okay, then we can also do purposive sampling. Here, in purposive sampling, we deliberately select subjects because they have a certain knowledge or a certain expertise, or they have specific characteristics that are relevant to our research problem. Okay, so for example, we're interested in surfers with disabilities, meaning people with disabilities who seriously go for surfing. Okay, so researcher might deliberately search for people with these unique characteristics. Okay, because those characteristics are central to their research problem. The last example of non-probability sampling that we will talk about is convenience sampling. Okay, so this is when the researcher samples whatever individuals were readily available, without any attempt to make the sample representative of a population. Like some of you, for example, might have experienced walking in a mall, and then somebody comes up to you and asks you, "Would you like to participate in our survey?" and hands you. Okay, that is an example of convenience sampling, or specifically a mall intercept. Okay, but it's convenience sampling because the researchers or the surveyors give the samples to anybody they meet. There's no randomness to their process, and they give them to anybody who agrees. Okay, so convenience sampling, there is going to be sampling bias, because the people, for example, the people who are not at that particular time and place will have no chance of being selected. Okay. Second, there will be some form of self-selection bias. Those who are very interested in the sample will be more likely to agree to participate in that sample. Okay. So just to recap, so how do you decide on your sampling method? So first is, do you know the population that you want to sample? Meaning, do you know who are the members, or what kinds of people are part of your population, or who are the people that are in your sample? Okay, that means, do you have a sampling frame for the population that you want to study? Okay, if the answer is yes, then you do probability sampling. Okay, Now, if you're going to do probability sampling, do you have a list? Do you have lists for specific sampling frames that are manageable? Okay. If you do not have any feasible lists, then you do cluster sampling, so that you might go down to a lower level, lower groupings, and maybe in those smaller groups you'll be able to develop your sampling frame. Now, if you have lists already, let's say number of voters in a barangay, okay? Next question, is the list already random? Okay? If it's already given to you randomly, for example, it's not given to you alphabetically, okay? Then you can do systematic random sampling. If it's not, then you check. Then, if the list is not already random, the next question is, are there subgroups in the list? Okay. If there are no subgroups in the list, then you can do simple random. Then you go ahead and do simple random sampling. If there are subgroups that you are interested in that are part of your study, then you do stratified sampling. And then you may have to make a decision of whether you want to do proportionate or disproportionate sampling, depending on your research method, research problems and objectives. Now, if you do not know the sample that you want to, the population that you want to sample, then you have no choice. You have to do non-probability sampling when you have no means of developing a sampling frame from your population. So first question, is the sample limited to a given population in a specific time and place? For example, you want to survey people at the airport in a particular time and place, then you do convenience sampling. Okay. If not, if you're not limited to a specific time and place, then you could do snowball sampling. Okay, and then the last question is, are you interested in specific characteristics or traits of your subjects that cannot be randomly found or determined? Then you can do purposive sampling. Okay, so now that we've talked about sampling, we can go ahead now with our methods for data collection.